Welcome to the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit. These weekly podcasts feature expository messages delivered to edify the soul. Now let's join Pastor Dave as he presents this week's message.
Well, if you want to take your Bible and turn with me to Matthew chapter 26, we're going to begin our reading today in verse 57. And so we come to the trial today. Or we could call this the other Palm Sunday, because this is the part of the story where Jesus is struck with the palms of the hands of those in the council. So it's not palm fronds, but it's palms of hands. I guess that's the other little-known Palm Sunday. Of course, it's not a Sunday when this happens, is it? We're going to begin in 57, and we're going to read down through 68. 57 through 68 today. I'm going to entitle the message today, Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? And when they had laid hold on Jesus, led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. But Peter followed him afar off unto the high priest's palace, and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. At the last came two false witnesses, and said, This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God, and to build it in 3 days. And the high priest arose and said unto him, Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? But Jesus held his peace. And the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus saith unto him, Thou hast said, Nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall you see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. What think ye? And they answered and said, He is guilty of death. Then did they spit in his face, buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is he that smote thee? Well, who are you? Have you ever had anybody ask you that question? Usually we don't use those words. Maybe someone says, well, tell me about yourself. We often ask that question when we're introducing ourselves to others. We're asked, introduce yourself, tell me about yourself, where do you come from, what do you do? And, what do you say when somebody asks you that question, or when you're put in the position to be asked that question? Well, you might say that, you're the spouse of so-and-so, or you're the parent of so-and-so, or the grandparent of so-and-so, or you might tell your occupation if you're a man, or your hobbies, the place of your birth or your home, who your parents are or were, your favorite music, or perhaps even your favorite sports team. I'm a U of L fan. That's what I say too, Jerry, actually, this year. Although I was really proud of my U of L's girls basketball team. They did real good this year. So you might say something like that. And all of that really it creates a profile for your hearer about who you are. It frames in 3 dimensions you. And so all of that, your origin, your family life, your history, your occupation, your education, your hobbies, whatever it might be, or maybe where you've been in life, all of that begins to build a three-dimensional picture of who you are. And so all these things, creating this profile, is kind of something like what we find here in the council. The council, after their failure to find a credible pair of witnesses, goes back to the question which was at the heart of their inquiry, who is this Jesus? John's gospel starts out that way. You know, when they show up to John the Baptist and they say, "Who are you? Are you the Christ? Tell us plainly who you are." And then he says, "No, it's not me." And then, of course, later on in that chapter, Jesus walks by and he points and he says, "There's the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world." So this question of identity is really at the heart of their inquiry here in Matthew's gospel. Who is Jesus? However, they really didn't want to know who he was. They didn't really care because they already had decided what they were going to do with him. But I think maybe for their morbid curiosity, they wanted to know. They wanted to hear him say who he was. Because, as I said, they've already decided in their hearts to destroy him. So we come to 57, and in verse 57 and 58, we have this contrast. Now, I'm not going to talk about Peter today. We have Peter mentioned here in 58, and then in 69, we pick up Peter again in the courtyard. So I'm not going to really mention Peter much, but just it's interesting, the contrast, because we have Jesus who is led, by the mob, the soldiers and Judas and all those, to Caiaphas' palace. Peter sort of sneaks in. He finds his way in somehow. He has to have John. In John's gospel, John knows the high priest's servants, and so he gets Peter in. You know, when you have, I know a guy. Well, Peter knew a guy that could get him in. So Peter's in the outside while Jesus is in the inside. Jesus is in the courtroom there. Peter's out in the courtyard. Jesus is being questioned by the high priest and the council while Peter's being questioned by the servants. Jesus was silent before his accusers, but Peter didn't know enough to keep his mouth shut. So there's this lovely little contrast that happens between what happens inside and outside between these two. And of course, we really have to have the story of Peter here. I don't think anybody would be satisfied with this if Peter didn't show up in the courtyard. Because this is just who Peter is. The rest of the disciples, unnamed, we know who they are, but they're unnamed, and they fled. Of course they did, but not Peter. Peter's going to follow, get as close as he can, and find out. But notice what verse 58 says here. Peter followed after him unto the high priest's palace and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. So Peter's already decided too that this is it. And what a morbid curiosity for a disciple to come and see the end. Well, you know what they say about if it bleeds, it leads. We're always interested, aren't we, in the gruesome and the grotesque. We're always interested in the failings of others. And I'm sure Peter, in the midst of his grief also, was trying to connect his grief to something. And so he's looking for this end. Well, I said I wasn't going to preach about Peter. So come to 59 now. The chief priests and the elders and the council all sought false witnesses against Jesus. Now, this thing about Jesus' identity, who is he, is something that has been going on. It goes all the way back to chapter 12 in Matthew's gospel. In Matthew chapter 12, verses 6 to 8, Jesus said to his disciples, I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. But if ye had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, ye would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath day. Now, don't you know that got them stirred up? And then he went into the synagogue, and in that same passage, he heals the man with the withered hand. And that got them stirred up. And then in Matthew 12:14, the Pharisees went out and held a council against him, how they might destroy him. That's in chapter 12. So they've had this desire to destroy Jesus ever since chapter 12 in Matthew's gospel. Again, in Matthew chapter 21, and I'm not going to read all of that, but 33 through 44, Jesus is telling lots of parables. And this particular one is the parable of the landholder who goes away and leaves his property with the servants, and then they kill the servants that he sends them, and eventually they kill the son and cast him out of the place. And Jesus says, what shall be done unto these wicked servants? And the Pharisees who are listening to this say, the Lord of those people will come and utterly destroy those miserable men. And then suddenly Jesus, he tells this parable, and the chief priests in the parables, when they heard the parables, they perceived that he spake of them. How perceptive. But when they sought to lay hands on him, they feared the multitude because they took him for a prophet. So all of this angst and anger has been stewing the entire Gospel of Matthew. Jesus would say something, and then they would just get so angry, and they want to kill him. It happened over and over again. Also in chapter 26, verse 3, then assembled the chief priests and the scribes and the elders of the people under the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and consulted that they might take Jesus by subtlety and kill him. So even in chapter 26, 2 days before the events that we're about to read, we have the people, the priests and the elders and so forth, gathering together to decide to kill Jesus because they've got him close by. He's not in Galilee now. He's in Jerusalem. So if they're going to do something, now's the time. And they're pent up. This anger that they have for Jesus is just overwhelmed them. In 27:1, we haven't read that yet, but just look ahead in 27:1. When the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. So they have him. Now they've made their decision. So how do they execute Jesus? They can't do it themselves. They have to find a way. So they take him to Pilate. And then in 27:41 through 43, we have the chief priests mocking him as he hangs on the cross. He saved others, himself he cannot save, they said. If he be the king of Israel, let him come down from the cross and we will believe him. He trusted in God, let him deliver him now if he will have him. For he said, I am the Son of God. Does that sound anything like the psalm we read this morning? Yeah, it's exactly what they're doing, exactly what the psalmist said they were going to do. So you see this desire, this drive that they have to get rid of this man named Jesus. Now Jesus knew this and told his disciples all about his death at the hands of these people. In Matthew chapter 16, Matthew chapter 20, Matthew chapter 26, he continues to remind them as he's heading towards Jerusalem, I'm going there. He says in 16:21, he says, I'm going, from this time forth, Jesus began to show his disciples how that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and the chief priests and scribes and be killed and raised the third day. So he's been very clear about it. He knows who is going to do the job, and he knows what's going to happen, and he knows what's going to happen 3 days later. He's going to rise from the dead. Matthew chapter 20, we have it again in 18 through 19. We're going to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be betrayed. The chief priests, the scribes, they shall condemn him to death. Matthew chapter 26, verses 1 and 2. It came to pass when Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days is the feast of the Passover, the Son of Man is betrayed to be crucified. So he continues to tell them, this is what's going to happen to me. He is not confused about that. He knows exactly what's coming, just as we examined last week in the garden. He knew exactly what was coming. And so he prayed about that thing that was coming. Jesus tells his disciples to prepare them what exactly is going to happen. And so with this as a backdrop, let's just look at the council meeting now. And first of all, I want to examine the strategy of the council. You notice there it says in 59, now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witnesses against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Yea, and though many false witnesses came, they found none. Yet they found none. So the first statement it's really almost poetic in the way that it's framed, and it's certain repeats of the same information give us that sense of Hebrew poetry here. Notice, false witnesses against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Yea, many false witnesses came, and yet found they none. So you see the repeat of false witnesses and found none here. The same information repeated over and over. It's very poetic in a sense from a Hebrew perspective. And of course, Matthew is writing to a generally Hebrew or Jewish audience. So they had counseled together, the elders and the chief priests, and they're looking for false witnesses. The sadness is that they sought and found someone. They found lots of someones who would be willing to tell a lie. Isn't that a sad thing? They're looking for people to witness against Jesus. But as clever and as crafty, and I'm sure as deep as their pockets were, they couldn't find anyone to tell the same truth. You see, the Sanhedrin was bound by a set of rules. The two witnesses who would come together and say something about someone else had to agree on the year, the time of year, the month, the time of month, the day, the hour of the day, and where it took place. Now, I doubt that these guys at this very illegal meeting of the council in Caiaphas' house were following the rules exactly. But I would imagine that a lot of the council probably were thinking of these rules when they were hearing these guys talk and were just saying to themselves, look, there is no way that we can present this to anybody as proof. Because all of these witnesses, they didn't match up. They were looking for these people, but nothing was matching up. They had an ample supply of people who were willing. I think that's the sad part. And this is in light of all the thousands of people that Jesus had healed and helped, and the multiplied thousands who knew of his works on their friends and their family members. And yet we have in Jerusalem this large assembly of people who are willing to be bought as false witnesses. And then it says, at the last came two. Okay, so the council needed witnesses that, had a story that was condemning, at least enough so that they could satisfy their bloodlust. And here come two, and we know what their testimony was. Fellow said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. So they had to have something that agreed that they could take and twist. And it had to look above board. They needed to do, what they really needed was a social media search. They needed to find the off-color picture, tweet, post, article, blog, podcast that they could twist into a justifiable death sentence. That's what they needed. They needed two people to agree on what Jesus had said somewhere, sometime, but they couldn't find it. And they needed to do this because their system of justice demanded two witnesses to confirm a crime. Deuteronomy chapter 17 and Deuteronomy 19 are the background to this. 17:6 says, at the mouth of two witnesses or three witnesses shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. But at the mouth of one witness shall he not be put to death. So that's why they needed two, so that their death penalty would stick. Deuteronomy 9:15 says, one witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or for any sin. In any sin that he sinneth, at the mouth of two witnesses or at the mouth of three witnesses shall the matter be established. So they needed this multiplicity of witnesses so that they could kill Jesus. They couldn't do it without that. At least they were bound by that kind of thing. The problem with the testimony here, you notice it's not really enough to kill Jesus. In verse 61, and said, these two witnesses said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. Well, the irony of this testimony is that Jesus is talking about his death and resurrection. And now they bring it into the council chamber and they say, oh, we remember now. This is what he said. I can destroy this temple and build it back in 3 days. Isn't that ironic? Here we have the Son of God who has prophesied of his own death and resurrection, and now we have the false witnesses remembering that and saying, we remember what he said, but to destroy the temple is just not enough. No. Go back to Deuteronomy 17. You look at the condition of the sin that is witnessed against. It wasn't a sin that someone could be killed over. If there be found among you any within thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, man or woman, that hath wrought wickedness in the sight of the Lord thy God, in transgressing his covenant, and hath gone and served other gods, and worshipped them, either the sun or the moon or any of the hosts of heaven, which I have not commanded. Jesus hadn't done that. And so when they said, well, he said he could tear the temple down and rebuild it in 3 days, that's not enough. It's just not enough. So, the high priest, he gets up out of his seat. He should never have left his seat. He was not to leave his seat. But he was so enraged. He was so ready to have Christ that he rose up and said to him, and I would imagine he said it in quite a loud voice, "Answer thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee?" And of course, this answers the question, was it enough? It wasn't enough. Because apparently, it wasn't because they needed Jesus to say something that would incriminate him. They needed Jesus to add commentary that they then could twist for their purpose. But Jesus said nothing. And as a matter of fact, verse 63 says, Jesus held his peace. This is Jesus' defense, which is no defense at all. He didn't need to defend himself against falsehoods and lies. He didn't need to defend himself against mockers and scorners. He didn't need to do that. He was sinless and guiltless. And if this had been a fair trial, he would have walked out of there unharmed. But as Peter said, after the day of Pentecost, or at the day of Pentecost, him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye have taken, and by wicked hands have crucified and slain. They were determined, but Jesus knew what they were up to. And this too is a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Jesus holds his peace. Isaiah chapter 53, when Isaiah speaks of the suffering servant, he said, he was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Jesus doesn't need to say a word, and he's not going to say a word. He's not only defending himself by not speaking, he's also fulfilling Bible prophecy. And then we have the rage of a madman. The high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. This is what they truly wanted. They wanted to hear Jesus answer. And the question is a trap. I don't know why they didn't lead with this. I guess they wanted the witnesses so that, they would have credible evidence, to present. But the question itself is a trap. He says, I adjure thee by the living God. That is, he commands Jesus to take an oath in God's name to say yes or no, I am the Son of God. Now, Jesus has to answer here, because if he doesn't answer, they would consider that blasphemy against the name of God. When the high priest, the Jewish high priest, asked this question, you must swear to me in God's name. You can't be silent. So it's a trap. Jesus now has to speak. And the answer is to the question whether he is Christ, the Son of God. Now you understand that Christ means Messiah. Christ is just the Greek name for the Hebrew word Messiah. So they wanted to know, are you Messiah? Who is God's Son? So Jesus has to speak now. And as I said, the question is a trap, because if he doesn't say anything, then they would condemn him of blasphemy. If he does say something, now he has two choices. He can either lie and say, oh no, I'm not the Son of God, which of course he's not going to do, or he could tell the truth. Yes, I am Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. So either way, they're going to get what they want, because we know Jesus is not going to fudge the truth here. So he has to speak. And so it really doesn't matter that he speaks or not, because the end result's going to be the same. They're going to condemn him for death. But he speaks up. And this is, this question is the same question that they've asked him before. In Matthew chapter 21, when he was come to the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, by what authority doest thou these things? And who gave thee this authority? Of course, it's kind of a backdoor question. Who are you? How do you do these things? Who gave you the authority to do them? And who is it that gave it to you? Of course, the people knew. All the people knew except for the chief priests, apparently. And they were all amazed, Mark says in his first chapter. They were all amazed insomuch as they questioned among themselves, saying, "What thing is this? What new doctrine is this? For with authority commandeth he that even the unclean spirits, and they do obey him." Yeah. People knew. The priests, they probably knew, but they didn't want to believe it. Caiaphas asked this question, "I adjure thee by the living God that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God." So who is Jesus? Well, listen to his words. Jesus said unto him, "Thou hast said." Jesus speaks and gives them exactly what they want. Thou hast said. This is like saying, you said it. You know, if somebody says something, Kentucky basketball is the greatest basketball team in the world. And another Kentucky fan will say, "You said it, man." Or you might say, "Amen." Or you might say, "Yeah, man, that's right." You know, now that's English 21st century slang, and we don't want to apply that to the words of Christ, but that's the idea. Jesus is affirming the truth that Caiaphas just spoke. Are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? Jesus said, yes. Now, if you want something more than that, just look at Mark's telling of this incident. From Mark 14, Jesus said to the same question, Jesus said, "I am." He doesn't mince words there, does he? Yeah, Mark's telling of it is pretty straightforward. So he is affirming exactly what Pilate said. If you want it any clearer, just as I said, look to Mark. "Nevertheless," he says. Now he goes on here. "Nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power." Now, as Jesus said to him, "Yes, I am," they're all sneering at him. They're probably chuckling under the breath. "Oh, here it is. We have the crazy man now speaking." They're probably jeering him. And maybe they're sneering at him. And maybe even their blood is boiling over that anybody would dare say that they're the Christ. And Jesus says, "Nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." Now, this image was not lost on the council, as they would recognize the language of Psalm 110, which is spoken of the Messiah. "The Lord said unto my Lord, Sit thou here at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool." They knew that psalm. Everybody knew that psalm because that is a messianic psalm. And then he says to them, "Coming in the clouds of heaven." This too is a reference to Messiah that the council would have known. And now Jesus is appropriating this for himself. And this comes from Daniel chapter 7. Daniel said, "I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him before him. And there was given to him dominion and glory and a kingdom, and all the people, nations, languages should serve him. And his dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed." You see, Jesus is standing before them in his humility, in his condescension, in his ragged robes, before a group of men who hate him, who sneering at him, who want to kill him, chomping at the bit to put him on the cross. And Jesus says, "I am." Now listen, "Nevertheless, you will see the Son of Man coming." He won't come back in the clouds of heaven. He won't be seated on that throne in those humble robes that he's wearing, standing before those people. And they won't be sneering in that day, because there they will see seated the Son of God. There they will see him coming in the clouds of glory. There will be no sneering. There will be no chomping at the bit. No, it'll be different. So when Jesus says, "You have said," and nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. He makes it so clear there is no doubt who he is. And he gives us this beautiful picture. Seated on the right hand of power, coming in the clouds of heaven. Psalm 110 Daniel chapter 7. And the high priest, that place must have erupted. All except for perhaps Joseph and Nicodemus, but it just must have erupted. They were so violently ready to kill him. And no wonder the high priest says these words. The high priest rent his clothes, saying, "He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses?" Save your money, boys. Send the witnesses home. We don't need anybody to say a word. We've all heard it. Now the council, the Sanhedrin was 70 individuals plus Moses, so that would have been 71. When they first founded it, it would have been 70 plus 1. So that to do this, they would have had to have a quorum of at least 23 people in that room when Jesus showed up. So it could have been the entire council, probably was. Probably was all 70 of them, maybe minus Joseph, maybe minus Nicodemus. They may have not been there, but it does say that Joseph did not consent, so perhaps he was there. The high priest tears his clothes, which is what the high priest is supposed to do when he hears blasphemy like this. He has spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of any witnesses? No wonder the high priest erupts. I would imagine that the entire chamber was filled with the wails of these jackals. What is blasphemy? Leviticus gives us the first example of this, and it was an event that happened that the people of Israel weren't really sure what to do about. Let me just read to you from Leviticus chapter 24. An Israelitish woman's son blasphemed the name of the Lord and cursed, and they brought him unto Moses. His mother's name was Shelemith, the daughter of Dibri, of the tribe of Dan. And they put him inward, that the mind of the Lord might be showed them. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Bring forth him that hath cursed without the camp. Let all that heard him lay their hands upon his head. Let all the congregation stone him. And thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel, saying, Whosoever curseth his God shall bear his sin. And he that blasphemeth the name of the Lord, he shall surely be put to death. And all the congregation shall certainly stone him, as well the stranger as he that is born in the land. When he blasphemes the name of the Lord, shall he be put to death. So for Christ Jesus to claim to be the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, was to curse and blaspheme the name of the Lord in their eyes. They thought Jesus was a madman, that he was blaspheming, that he was speaking against the Lord. The high priest says, Behold, now you have heard this blasphemy. What think ye? And they said, He's guilty of death. Well, there was no other decision to be made, right? Other than death. They had to do it now. And then we have the rage of the council there in 67. Then they did spit in his face and buffeted him. Others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy unto us, thou Christ. Who is he that smote thee? And you have this striking the face of Jesus in all the Gospels. And I don't remember which one it is. It's done by the soldiers, where they blindfold him and then they hit him and ask him to prophesy. Dr. J. Vernon McGee calls that the game of hot hand. The soldiers loved to play that game. They would blindfold, and then they would start hitting, and they would say, "Tell us who did it, if you can." It was a cruel game. It was awful. So they spit in his face, buffeted him. Others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy unto us, thou Christ. Who is he that smote thee? And here we have even more prophecy. Job chapter 16, Job chapter 30, Isaiah chapter 50. We have all of it together. The spitting, the hitting, the pulling out of the hair, all of it just described there. All of the passion of Jesus as it begins right here in the council chamber. And of course, Isaiah is the one that we know best of all. The Lord hath opened mine ear, and I was not rebellious, neither turned away back. I gave my back to the smiters, my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I did not hide my face from shame and spitting. Adam Clark says, thus they offered him indignity in all its various and vexatious forms. Insults of this kind are never forgiven by the world. Jesus not only takes no revenge, though it be completely in his power, but bears with all meekness without even one word of reply. As a lamb before his shears was dumb, so he opened not his mouth. So how do we apply this? Well, first of all, I think the doctrine here just stands out like a neon sign, kind of flashes at us. Jesus knew he was God's son. He knew who he was, and he told them plainly. He told them in language that was unequivocal, that they understood, that they knew, that they had probably preached and taught. And he told them in such a way that they were going to do something about it. And just like we might build a profile by telling things about ourselves, so Jesus, by his words and experiences in the courtroom, tells us who he is. His silence witnessed to the fact that he was the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. His words, referencing Psalm 110 and Daniel 7, told the council that he was the Son of God, the Son of Man, the Messiah. And his abuse at the hands of the council tells us that he was the Christ foretold in Job and Isaiah. We know exactly who he is, and he knew exactly who he is at that time and today yet. But notice how they all, although knowing who Christ was, responded differently. Jesus knew who he was, and he was going to the cross because he knew who he was. But what about Peter? He knew who Jesus was, yet he was in the outer court, dodging the questions of the young women and the servants, and cursing and denying. And what about Pilate? Pilate knew who he was. He knew that the Pharisees and the scribes and the priests all condemned him as being the king of the Jews and the Son of God. Pilate knew who he was, and yet Pilate still sent him to the cross. What about the disciples? They knew who he was because they had heard it said by Jesus himself who he was, and yet they were scattered, afraid of what might happen if they were connected to him. And what about the mob? The mob in the courtroom that came in paid to be the false witnesses, and the mob before Pilate's throne on the pavement. They all knew who Jesus was, and yet they were willing to send him to the cross. You know who Jesus is because I just told you today. How do you respond to Jesus? You know him to be Christ, the Son of God. What about it? How have you replied? What have you said to him? How have you believed or not believed? How have you acted or not acted? Because see, right now, because I've preached this message and we've all heard the words of Christ, we all know exactly who he is. We now stand with the responsibility upon our hearts. What do we do with this one called Jesus? Second point of application here is the world system hates Christ and by extension his church. We saw this in a very graphic way this very week as that young lady walked into a Christian school and murdered 6 people, 3 of which were 9-year-old children. Why did she walk into a Christian school? Because she had targeted those Christian people in that lovely place. Why? Because the world hates Christ and by extension his church. That's us. Ladies and gentlemen, we are sheep for the slaughter in the world's eyes. But as Paul writes in Romans chapter 8, nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. Thirdly, Jesus went willingly to the cross, suffered silently before the determinate counsel for us. This emphasizes the importance of prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus was ready. He had set his face like flint to go to Jerusalem, but once he got there, that prayer in the garden readies him for what was next. And what was next was horrible. It was grotesque. It was monstrous. But he was ready, and he went. And when he stood before that council, he didn't say a word. He knew he was innocent, and he knew what they were going to do, but he was ready. I think it points us, ladies and gentlemen, to the importance of not a prayer perhaps for us in the Garden of Gethsemane, but a prayer for us in our closets before we go out for the day. Because we don't know what horrible, monstrous thing we might encounter. But if we've prayed and readied ourselves for the day, we'll be ready. Jesus suffered this injustice, this miscarriage of justice for you. Again, let me go back and just ask you that question. What do you do with this one called Christ? And maybe the best question of all for every one of us is this. You can go back to the beginning of my message. Who are you? Now, you could tell me who your wife is, who your husband is, who your children are, who your family is, where you're from, what you do, what you love, what you enjoy, all of that. You can tell me all of that. But it really doesn't tell me who you are. Are you a believer or not? What have you done with Jesus?
Jesus will meet you.
Thanks for listening to this week's message. Please join us again next time for another installment of the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit.